The Ear to Asia podcast is made available on the Jakarta Post platform under agreement between the Jakarta Post and the University of Melbourne.
Hello, I'm Sammy Shah. This is Ear to Asia.
The promise for development and the promise for food security come at the expense of our forests, because at the moment, the government looked at forests simply as commodities and resources, instead of seeing forests as ecosystem services that is required for our well-being and our long-term prosperity as a nation.
A large proportion of lawmakers in Indonesia today have ties and stakes in the extractive industries themselves, and they can not only hide behind the law, but also help create laws that continue to not prioritize environmental protection because they have clear interests to protect as well.
In this episode, profit, politics, and the future of Indonesia's rainforests. Ear to Asia is the podcast from Asia Institute, the Asia research specialists at the University of Melbourne. Indonesia's 17,000 plus islands cradle the planet's third largest expanse of tropical rainforest, around 10% of what the world still has left. These forests are more than a national treasure. They're a living bulwark against climate change, a last refuge for orangutans, tigers, elephants, and rhinos, and a cultural heartland for hundreds of indigenous communities. Yet in 2024, Indonesia lost an area of forest 4 times the size of Jakarta, some 261,000 hectares, its worst single-year decline since 2021. Why has deforestation spiked just as earlier trends appear to be improving? The answers lie not only in the familiar story of palm oil, but increasingly in pulp wood plantations, critical mineral mining, and a policy environment that treats clearing as the fast track to economic opportunity. Meanwhile, ambitious, supersized food security schemes promise rice, sugarcane, and even biofuels, but don't count the ecological and social cost. The clearing of peatlands and mangroves, despite warnings about poor soil and indigenous land rights, threaten to undermine both climate targets and community livelihoods. Mining for the nickel that powers the global EV boom is uprooting villages and silting once productive fishing grounds. So, with the new administration under President Prabowo Subianto now 6 months old, is Jakarta poised to take forest protection seriously, or will it be business as usual? What reforms could curb land bank speculation, steer investment towards already cleared ground, and safeguard habitats that are perilously close to ecological tipping points? And how can accountability thrive when 3 out of 5 Indonesian lawmakers reportedly hold stakes in extractive industries? Joining me to examine the forces reshaping Indonesia's landscape are Fawwiza Farhan, a multi-award winning forest conservationist and a leader of Forest, Nature and Environment Aceh, an Indonesia conservation NGO, and Dr. Charlotte Setiadi, a seasoned Indonesia watcher from Asia Institute. Welcome to Ear to Asia, Fawwiza and Charlotte.
Hi, Sammy and listeners. Thank you for having us here.
Hi, Sammy and listeners. Happy to be here.
All right, let's start with you, Fawwiza. If you can give us a brief description of Indonesia's geography and natural environment.
For those who are not familiar, Indonesia hosts the third largest area of tropical rainforest in the world, covering approximately 90 million hectares. It's 10% of the world's remaining rainforest. This archipelago is incredibly biodiverse and geographically rich as well, with high level of endemicism, meaning species that only exist in these areas and nowhere else in the world. Conserving Indonesian natural biodiversity is globally significant because globally we are facing the threat of planetary crisis. Biodiversity collapse and changing climates are just 2 out of 9 planetary health indicators that we are concerned about. So Indonesia plays an incredibly important role in ensuring conservation of global biodiversity as well as stabilizing the climate.
In terms of conservation, what's left of the natural environment over there, why does it matter to the rest of the world?
Because, if we talked about biodiversity conservation, we talked about multi-layered species that exist in various ecosystems. Indonesia have some of the largest coral reef. Indonesia have some of the most biodiverse tropical rainforests. For example, in the landscape like the Loiser ecosystem where I work, it is the last place on Earth where the critically endangered megafauna and the Sumatran tiger, rhino, elephant, and orangutan still roam together in the wild. But beyond these 4 species, Loiser is also home to hundreds different types of birds, insects, reptiles, and amphibians. And many of these species are yet to be discovered. When we think about the importance of protecting global biodiversity, we looked at the distribution of species, we looked at the habitat, and we look at the threat that is faced by these species.
Charlotte, Indonesia's deforestation increased in 2024 to its highest level since 2021, with 261,575 hectares of forest lost. That's an area 4 times the size of Jakarta. What, in your view, are the primary reasons for this alarming surge in deforestation, especially when previous years showed a decline?
Yeah, absolutely. In 2024, it was a particularly bad year for environmental conservation in Indonesia. And there are a number of different reasons that can be attributed to this recent spike in deforestation. For instance, the expansion of pulpwood plantations, government-backed food estate projects in Papua and Kalimantan that involve the deforesting of millions of hectares of virgin forests, mining as well, tied to Indonesia's catering to global demands for electric vehicle batteries, for instance. Of course, this also has to do with some electoral promises that were promised by Prabowo Subianto prior to his election as president in late 2024, promising Indonesians greater food security, which meant the acceleration of projects such as the food estate projects in Papua and Kalimantan. And these factors all contribute to the spike in deforestation, and it also shows that Indonesia's development priorities 80 years on from independence in 1945 still does come at the expense of its forests. And politicians' promises for things such as greater food security very much lead to negative consequences for the environment directly.
Faweza, why haven't the current conservation efforts been able to keep pace with the changing demands?
Yeah, in my opinion, the reason why conservation initiatives have not been able to keep up with the rise of deforestation is simply because conservation initiatives are not necessarily integrated into political and policy perspective. The reason why I'm saying this is many of the drivers of conservation initiatives have been nonprofits working on the ground. It's not necessarily government in the that have hold of policy and power that share this perspective of the importance on conserving our forests and our environment. That what Charlotte have mentioned earlier, the promise for development and the promise for food security come at the expense of our forests, because at the moment the government looked at forests simply as commodities and resources instead of seeing forests and seascape as ecosystem services that is required for our well-being and our long-term prosperity as a nation.
And if I may add, Sammy, there's also legal mechanism for the government justifying its actions in the name of development and in the name of providing for the Indonesian people, right? Like, for instance, in the 1945 constitution itself that has been in place since Indonesia's independence in 1945. just shortly after Indonesia's independence in 1945, Article 33 of the Indonesian Constitution states that the land, the waters, and the natural resources within the borders of Indonesia shall be under the powers of the state and shall be used to the greatest benefit of the people. So you see that in the wording of the Constitution itself, in terms of how the government is given the power to administer the natural resources and environment in Indonesia. It has a very developmentalist approach that doesn't safeguard environmental protection and prioritizes resource provision above anything else.
Faweza, there's not just the the palm oil, the pulpwood, the mineral mining practices. There's also things like land banking and the increasing access of mining permits. Can you explain a little bit about what's changing here? How is all of this being kept legal?
How all of these are being kept legal? I mean, that's how do I put it? I think the perspective throughout the 90s is a lot of people focus on illegal logging, and beyond that, there's a whole lot of focus on encroachment. But now we are seeing the increased environmental destruction through legal means, and it's really not difficult when a piece of paper from people in power, be it head of district, head of province, or any government officials, could allow certain destructions to take place legally. We looked at what happened in small islands on the eastern part of Indonesia that is currently under a lot of heat for nickel mining because of the view, the dreams of hilirisasi, the dreams of energy transition, and the dream of transforming our society. But that dream is not created in parallel of just social justice transition. The dream is created in the perspective that we need to be the provider of battery and electric vehicles, not necessarily just transport systems that could work in cities in Indonesia. So this gap in perspective of the government on how they see their role as enablers for this energy transition have put us in this situation.
Well, you've talked then about critical mineral mining. A lot has been written already about the focus on palm oil. But the one that does not get as much mention is pulpwood plantations. Just how large of a aspect of the deforestation is that one area?
In 2004, pulpwood plantation account, I think, for nearly 50% of deforestation in Kalimantan. But a whole lot of this deforestation happened within the concession. So it's legal, but doesn't mean it's right. Legality is simply the perspective of a current time. So when something is legal, doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. And at the moment in time, the Indonesian government see destruction of the environment as pathway for development, and therefore all these legal activities could bring future destructions or current destructions, actually.
Charlotte, some of the justification for a lot of this activity has been Indonesia's growing population. Over 280 million people. It's obviously a national policy priority, particularly food security. How is Jakarta going about improving food security for this population?
Well, at the moment, it's an ongoing huge issue in improving food security, providing for lower socioeconomic population was a huge part of the current President Prabowo Subianto's election promises, and which also got him elected too, among many other things. Not just the food estate project that we were briefly talking about before, but also his ambitious school lunch program that is causing a strain on the Indonesian budget at the moment, right? And also challenges such as higher cost of living, for instance. Lower socioeconomic Indonesians are struggling to make ends meet with commodity prices continuing to rise. And one of the big efforts that the Prabowo administration has been doing so far has been accelerating projects like the food estates. It's a big, ambitious project that, from a public relations perspective, seems to show that the Prabowo administration is making good with its promises of food self-sufficiency, decreasing the over-reliance that Indonesia has at the moment for the import of staple commodities such as rice. So back to what Parwiza was talking about before, a lot of the government's efforts, at least the ones that they're trying to communicate publicly about making good with its promises, with appearing like they are doing their best in providing for this growing population, has been at the direct expense of the environment, particularly in vulnerable areas such as Papua and East Kalimantan. Now, there has been a lot of criticism in the media among scholars and observers about the food estate projects themselves. There's a lot of controversy over the suitability of the land, whether after deforesting millions of hectares of forest land, Indonesia is actually going to be able to meet its food sufficiency targets. That is something that is still ongoing right now, and something that is thankfully getting a lot of attention both nationally and internationally. But it's clear that with the lofty promises, pre-election promises about food security, the Jakarta administration at the moment is struggling with programs like the free lunch program, and also the food estate projects as well.
Can both of you then talk a little bit about how the environmental and social impacts of these projects, like the Mega Rice Project in central Kalimantan, for example, how do they measure up against broader sustainability goals? Charlotte?
Well, the Mega Rice Project, it's interesting that you mentioned that. This was initiated in the mid 1990s in the southern sections of Kalimantan, and the goal was to turn 1 million hectares of, and quote unquote, unproductive and sparsely populated peat swamps and areas of forest into rice paddies. And it's problematic, of course, to designate any piece of land as unproductive or almost like a definition of terra nullius, right? Like that it's kind of like not used for anyone and anything, and therefore it's free to be used by the government for other purposes. But it's definitely not true from the perspective of the local populations. Just because this particular land is considered to be unproductive from the government's point of view doesn't mean that it doesn't hold significance for the local population, and doesn't mean that it's unproductive from their point of view as sources of food and important for their community, for instance. And this particular project, the Mega Rice Project, was very problematic because it was considered to be a failure, essentially. That despite all the clearing that happened, there were multiple problems, such as flooding in the rainy season, floods up to 2 meters deep, and in other times of the year, it's bone dry, making the land unproductive, and the government eventually abandoned the Mega Rice Project. but at the same time, the land that has been cleared ended up being dry peatland that became vulnerable to fires, which continue to break out on a massive scale. And this has implications, for instance, in terms of the haze problem that we see annually affecting neighboring countries like Singapore and Malaysia, right? Not to mention pollution to the rivers, and this was all because of loopholes in the planning, hasty decision making, design of the mega rice project that did not take into account the ecology of the environment, and this shows how political will overrides considerations for the native populations, for the ecology of the land itself, the suitability of the land for the purposes that the government wanted, and it has broader long-term domestic and international implications. So the Mega Rice Project is a cautionary tale for what can happen in projects such as the food estate project in Merauke. So and experts have pointed this out. And it's up to Jakarta to listen to this cautionary tale or not, and so far they have not.
You're listening to Ear to Asia from Asia Institute at the University of Melbourne. And just a reminder to listeners about Asia Institute's online publication on Asia and its societies, politics and cultures. It's called the Melbourne Asia Review. It's free to read and it's open access at melbourneasiareview.edu.au. You'll find articles by some of our regular Ear to Asia guests and by many others. Plus, you can catch recent episodes of Ear to Asia at the Melbourne Asia Review website, which again you can find at melbourneasiareview.edu.au. I'm Sami Shah, and I'm joined by Dr. Charlotte Setiadi of Asia Institute and Faweza Farhan. We're talking about the state of deforestation in Indonesia. Faweza, you've spoken about the challenges being put forward by what's defined as legal and not legal. What impact does this have on advocacy efforts?
Let me tell you a story, Sami. So in my work in the Loiset ecosystem began in this place called the Tripapit Swamp. So back in 2010, there's a palm oil company that were operating in this area, and they were clearing forests without permit. Our monitoring system detected it. At the time, I was working with the government, and then we sent them letters that said that you've been clearing land illegally, you should stop. And then the company didn't stop, so we sent another letter to the law enforcement, to the police, because this act is illegal. And the police responded by, yes, that's correct. This company has been clearing land illegally, and therefore they need to be given permit instead of punished. So then we take the case higher to court, and in the middle of the lawsuit, the land was then designated into moratorium. At the time, 2010, the first moratorium on new permit in primary forest and peatland was issued. So this land, this 1,600 hectares, was included in area that is completely off limit. And we are still in court when the company decided to escalate and burn this patch of land that they were clearing, still without permit. And after they burned, the Aceh government issued a permit for this company. It's all very convoluting. It's very confusing. As an advocate that is quite new in the landscape, how could this happen? What was illegal suddenly become legal with a piece of paper. So then we took the case against the permit itself to court. And while we were in court, the fire escalated again. Clearing land with fire is also illegal in Indonesia. So at this point in time, there is 3 layers of legality that the company have violated. The campaign escalated, it got really big, and a lot more people get involved, including central government at that time, represented by the UKP4, the Presidential Task Force on I forgot what it stands for. And the company was then, the lawsuit then get bigger, and the company was punished. The permit get revoked. The company was fined close to $26 million, and was told to restore the area. While all this was unfolding, we thought we were winning. The Aceh government decided to revise the Aceh Spatial Plan and remove the wording Loiser ecosystem from its list of national strategic area. And the consequences of this is all the land that is within the Loiser ecosystem that doesn't necessarily have conservation status would lose its protection, including the land that we just won and the Tripapit Swamp. The legality of forest management in Indonesia are not clear, and that's a problem. But at the same time, within this gray area, it also creates space and opportunity for us to make a difference, to change how things are being done on the ground. I come to realize that over the years of working in this landscape, that sometimes you just need to be very persistent, and that notion of patron and client relationships are incredibly incredibly obvious on the ground, that if you could weaken that support from the government patron against company that is acting illegally, law enforcement could be upheld.
Well, that's a very good example of what I was going to ask you next, is what specific policy changes are needed to protect the remaining natural forests within these existing concessions?
I think if we looked at the regulations that is being drafted but yet to be issued, like the regulations around indigenous forestry, the regulations, the forestry regulations, the recent more updated law on environmental protection, all that are important. But I really feel that we need to take many steps back and re-educate our entire population on our reliance to our ecosystems. Somehow that perspective needs to shift. We can't create a thriving economy without a healthy ecosystem.
The only thing that I might add to that is revising some of the more recent laws that have generated controversy and protest in Indonesia, such as the omnibus law that was passed under the previous President Joko Widodo during COVID times, that has been criticized for not including stronger environmental safeguards and as well as indigenous rights protections. There's an opportunity here for the Prabowo government to make good on its promises to also look after the environment by including stronger environmental safeguards and indigenous rights protections under laws such as the omnibus law. And I guess like the other obvious thing is to help new concessions. To add to Farwiza's point before about aligning more closely spatial planning laws with environmental and ecological needs.
It's no surprise that deforestation directly impacts critical habitats for endangered species. So, what conservation measures are needed then, beyond merely restricting new concessions? Fawiza?
Wow, that's a big question, Zoe. There's many layers into the very idea of conserving species. But if I could go back to one basic and the most important, it's probably really comes down on what we see as a priority. If we looked at landscapes like the Loiser ecosystems and Aceh province back in 2007 and 2008, under the leadership of Governor Irwandi, there's realization that Aceh is facing a huge deforestation threat because of the need to rebuild post-tsunami. And there was a active initiation to map out the forest in the entire province to see where are the area that we could still deforest without having massive consequences like floods and landslides, because these landscapes are incredibly sensitive. And from that mapping process, at the time they called it Tipiresca, this mapping process show that there are no more forests in Aceh that could be safely harvested or deforested without serious environmental consequences. And Aceh as a province at that time have to face this reality check that if they continue to deforest in business as usual, the threat of floods and landslide increase significantly, and that have economic consequences. So they need to think about different ways of developing without without taking massive chunk of the forest. So at that time, there was a design to restore the forest and transition into the type of economy that could actually be an example for the rest of Indonesia. However, here's the catch with political leadership. Political leadership is short. You might be the leaders for 1 or 2 terms, 5 to 10 years, and a whole lot of decisions that political leadership makes today over our forests and natural resources would have long-term consequences. We mapped out all of the most recent floodings in Aceh and matched that data with the economic loss caused by floods. And then we looked at the changes in forest cover in the water catchment where these floods happen. And we learned that many of the floods that happen in North Aceh district, for example, are some of the most economically consequential. However, there's hardly any deforestation that is happening in this area in the past 10 years. But if we pull it back even further, most of the deforestation happened between 80s and 90s. So it took about 30, 40 years for the consequences of deforestation to become so dire and difficult to repair. But by the time we get to a point of 30 and 40 years later, we forgot that we did that, and now we're paying the consequences. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Completely agree. And, this goes back to our earlier conversation point and example, Sammy, about, mega projects high on the policymakers' agenda at that time, like the mega rice project in Kalimantan. We're still paying the price for that misstep now, that catastrophic misstep now. And it's not just the indigenous communities that are still directly impacted until now, because it's the irony that at that time the Jakarta government designated this forest area as unproductive land. Well, thanks to what they did back in the mid 90s, it actually is unproductive land now, because it's now just dry peatland. And the fires and the haze that we see every year coming from this area continues to haunt the government because of complaints, of course, from neighboring ASEAN countries about the air pollution that came from the raging fires that came from this from the remnants of the mega rice project, right? So that just goes to show, like what Parwiza was saying before, the political gains are temporary, but the long-term consequences of these kinds of ill-planned projects continue to linger on decades afterwards.
Well, nearly half of or 44% of the land cleared in Indonesia between 1990 and 2020 remain idle for 5 years or more without detectable land use, often due to deliberate mechanical clearing for speculation and land banking for future palm oil development. This suggests a significant amount of cleared land is being land banked. How does this complicate efforts to accurately assess the true impact of commodity production like palm oil on deforestation? Faweza?
This is like the perspective inherited, I think, partly from back in the colonial times. And this perspective is continued to be pervasive, not only in Indonesia, but also globally, where we looked at land and design protected areas through a map instead of seeing how people relate to the land. We looked at areas, if these areas are high up in a mountain, difficult to access, then we designate these lands into protected areas. And any lowland forests, any pit swamps, then get earmarked for future development. This happens in Loiser, this happens across the world, and probably this also happens in much of Australia as well. The implications of land banking to accurately assess the true impact of commodity production then get a bit hazy. There's an initiative called Map Biomass, and at Map Biomass, you are able to see changes in land cover, not only to see perspective when forests are lost, but also to see a shift when forests are lost, what then came in that place? Is it become just a degraded land? Does it turn into palm oil plantation? Does it turn into coffee, cacao, pulp and paper? And this type of technology allow us to have a clear perspective on what is happening on the ground as an implications of policies that we push forward.
Indonesia appears to be a global hotspot for mining-driven deforestation. What unique characteristics of Indonesia's mining sector contribute to such a disproportionately high rate of forest loss then? Charlotte, do you want to go?
If we look at mining permits issuance in Indonesia, particularly in recent times, we can see that mining permits and the areas that have been designated for mining often overlap with forest areas, which means that as these mining projects become developed, it allows and causes deforestation in primary and peat forests, and particularly so for areas where we've seen increased activity for nickel and bauxite mining. And this has also been worsened by lack of government oversight, particularly from local governments, about making sure that the environmental impacts of these mining operations are not only minimized, but even done under regulation, which already, as Farwiza said before, just because it's legal doesn't mean that it's right. But oftentimes, the development of these mining projects also end up causing environmental loss and environmental destruction beyond what is legal, and also weak rehabilitation enforcement after the mining projects themselves have concluded. So this is why we see a direct link between mining operations and the granting of mining concessions with higher deforestation rates.
What are the challenges then in holding these mining players accountable for environmental rehabilitation? Farwiza?
I wanted to say corruption, but somehow it feels, oversimplifying. Of course, it's corruption, but at the same time, that relationship between businesses and politics are incredibly entrenched in places like Indonesia. If we looked at corruption cases across the country, a whole lot of that is cases, the biggest cases are cases around natural resources. One of the most famous case in regard to mining and corruption was the case of Harvey Moise in Bangka Belitung, I believe. The calculated state loss from environmental destruction amount to trillions of rupiah. But that's really how entangled power politics and resource extraction is in Indonesia.
Yeah, no, the Harvey Moise case is a really good example of this, a high-profile corruption case. the amount state losses that was estimated. I think something in the figure of like $15 billion or more. And the Harvey Muiz case was high profile because Harvey Muiz himself is a high profile character. He is married to a celebrity. But it is interesting because in the framing of cases like the Harvey Muiz case and many other cases to do with corruption in the mining sector or something to do with the link between corruption and environmental destruction. In the Indonesian media, going back to your question before, Sammy, about industrial players, the focus has been on the corrupt government officials, yes, but also on the corrupt industrial players as well. And in many of the cases, so in my own research, I look at ethnic Chinese identity politics in Indonesia. So it's been interesting to notice over the years that a lot of these industrial players, the owners of conglomerates, palm oil conglomerates, mining conglomerates in Indonesia, or at least the executives and the middle people, in a lot of cases they are ethnic Chinese. Like Harvey Muiz, for instance. And if we think about conglomerates such as the Sinarmas Group, they have, they're a huge player in the palm oil and pulp industries. So not just directly in terms of the environmental degradation issue itself, it also has consequences for how ethnic minorities like the Chinese in Indonesia are perceived in the public imagination and through reporting in Indonesian media, right? Like the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia already historically have a reputation, or at least there's the stereotype that all Chinese Indonesians are rich, and this is not true, of course, but in times of public debates or in times of high-profile cases that involve environmental destruction, such as in mining cases and deforestation issues, this also inflames already existing negative stereotypes and negative sentiments towards ethnic groups such as the Chinese as major industrial players. And in my opinion, this actually, like what Farwiza was saying before, oversimplifies the issue of large-scale corruption and the fact that the government over the decades have been the enablers for industrial players to get away with their bad environmental practices because it's legal, right? And it, from the government's point of view, having individual players or conglomerates from the private sector being blamed for environmental degradation is quite convenient because it detracts away from their own responsibility in environmental destruction. So it's very complex. It's not just about the environment itself, although that's of course a very important part of it, but it relates to other aspects in Indonesian life, such as interethnic relations and interclass relations as well.
There is the assumption that a high number of Indonesian lawmakers and cabinet officials having direct ties to extractive industries will have an impact on policy and protection and resource extraction in Indonesia. What does it mean for something like accountability and transparency, though? Charlotte?
Well, it has obvious negative consequences in terms of transparency, right? Like you mentioned before, a large proportion of lawmakers in Indonesia today have ties and stakes in the extractive industries themselves, and this has very direct systemic conflict of interest, influencing legislation, influencing policy, how they vote in favor of continued resources extraction over environmental protection and accountability. And as lawmakers, they can not only hide behind the law, but also help create laws that continue to not prioritize environmental protection because they have clear interests, clear business interests in to protect as well.
Faweza, a lot of the data about deforestation and land degradation originates from the Joko Widodo era. Now that we're more than 6 months into the Subianto Prabowo presidency, what has been his administration's impact on the preservation of forests?
I do not want to just simply swept all administrations into this terrible pot of people who are incredibly selfish and just simply trying to enrich themselves. We need to also understand the entanglement of Indonesia political system, how election time are very expensive. And so many good people that goes into politics then struggle in politics or having to adjust their stance in order to stay in power, in order to compromise, or simply facing the reality that the systems are also incredibly corrupt. So when we looked at the relationship between politicians and natural resources, as Charlotte mentioned earlier, how a whole lot of these politicians also have the perspective that the environment, natural resources are to serve development agendas. And oftentimes this relate directly to their agendas. At the beginning of his presidency, Prabowo Subianto have stated that palm oil is also trees, which is not wrong. But when the perspective of monoculture could be equals to biodiverse tropical rainforests, then we could immediately imagine how they value ecosystem services that various species in a diverse ecosystems bring. So what has been the impact of his presidency into the preservation of forests that has been largely negative, especially in areas that is targeted to be turned into food estate. However, I also must acknowledge that early on in his presidency, he give away about 20,000 hectares of land within his brother's concession to be turned into elephant corridor, elephant sanctuary. So that's good progress. But then if for 20,000 hectares in Aceh, then 20 million hectares of forest in Indonesia would be sacrificed. That's a little bit of a unbalanced equation, I think.
So then that leaves the final question, Charlotte. What is the likely trajectory going forward?
It's early days in the Prabowo presidency, right? He's not even 1 year in. He's got 4 more to go, and that's only considering if he only has 1 term. So far we've not seen good signs that his administration is going to be one that bucks the historical trend of Indonesian presidencies prioritizing development over environmental protection. However, never say never. We can only hope for the best. But unless there is a course correction, Indonesia is likely, I think, unfortunately, to see accelerated deforestation driven by pulp mining, food estate expansion, and this poses challenges to climate and biodiversity goals, despite of Indonesia's promises of being. Parvisa, you probably know the year for this. What's the Indonesia's commitment to be carbon zero by what year? Is it 2060 or something like that?
Yeah, 2060.
Yeah, 2060. Well, it doesn't look so good so far, right? Like 2060 is 35 years away. But considering that early in the presidency, Prabowo's presidency has been, like I mentioned before, been preoccupied by securing Indonesia's food security, making good on his election promises, and also wanting to take advantage of the global demand at the moment for nickel in particular. So it's really ironic that Indonesia's commitment to energy transition comes at the expense of its environment. So the trajectory is not looking good, but of course, we can only hope for the best in terms of course correction.
I would like also to add that sometimes we are so hopeful for politicians that they would change our life, that they would make the country better. And then we get disappointed when they, in turn, trying to fight for power and trying to continue clinging onto power. But then at the same time, the way I see the trajectory going forward is simply a very sober, realist perspective on looking at government policies and criticizing and protesting against policies that we think is inappropriate. Really, a podcast that I listened to recently with Jacinda Ardern said that we need to continue to expect the best out of the people we put in power, regardless whether we vote for them or not, and continue to hold politicians into account, because no matter what, they are driving the policies and therefore our country forward. Sometimes it felt like it's a very difficult times to be Indonesian at the moment. But then at the same time, this is also a vast country that holds hopes of 280 million peoples. I would love to just say that all is doomed, but it doesn't work that way. We are still in a much better place than many other countries, but there such a big room for improvement on policy side, environmental side, but also on social justice.
Our guests have been Faweza Farhan, forest conservationist and leader of Forest, Nature and Environment Aceh, an Indonesia conservation NGO, and Dr. Charlotte Setiadi of Asia Institute. Thanks to you both.
Thank you, Sammy.
Hi, Sammy and listeners.
Air to Asia is brought to you by Asia Institute of the University of Melbourne, Australia. You can find more information about this and all our other episodes at the Asia Institute website. Be sure to keep up with every episode of Air to Asia by following us on the Apple Podcasts app, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please rate and review it. Every positive review helps new listeners find the show. And please help us by spreading the word on your socials. This episode was recorded on the 4th of July 2025. Producers were Kelvin Param and Eric Van Bemmel of profactual.com. Air to Asia is licensed under Creative Commons, copyright 2025, the University of Melbourne. I'm Sammy Shah. Thanks for your company.